Today we're going to start with the next lecture in Systematic 2, the resurrection of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 15, 19 through 20 we find, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. The resurrection is one of the central tenets of Christian theology, and having a good understanding of what we are saying and what we are not saying as it relates to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead is important. We see a couple of different depictions of the resurrection, one in stained glass and a more traditional painting in the second. As far as the biblical witness goes, the resurrection is the testimony of the entire New Testament. Sometimes we have doctrines that are built on few passages and they may not have a tremendous amount of support from the Bible, but the resurrection is not one of those doctrines. In the Gospels, all four are witness to the life and ministry of Jesus as well as in giving us information about the resurrection. And each of the accounts in the Gospels shows a discernible unity in differences that demonstrates they are not just four accounts of the same testimony, but four independent testimonies of the same event. And we see different accounts here in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, listed Matthew 28, 1 through 20, Mark 16, 1 through 8, Luke 24, 1 through 53, and then John 20, 1 through 25 and verse 25. Now, what do we mean when we say that they show discernible unity in differences? Well, what we're talking about there is the idea that the accounts are coming from different perspectives of a single event, but the reports have enough differences in the way they are reported that we don't think it was simply a contrived story or account. What will sometimes happen when you are figuring out, trying to determine whether a report of an event is true or not, if you have multiple witnesses, you listen to the accounts. If they give you the exact same account, then you will be very suspect of the reliability of that account. It's more likely in that case that they all got together and said, this is what we're going to say, A, B, C, D. When you get reports, you expect some to describe the general events, but not with the same details, and perhaps the ordering may be a little bit different. And if you can imagine that you were at an intersection, and you had people on three different sides of the intersection and one person in a vehicle that was driving along as well. And if they each gave you the description of the events of an accident, you would expect them to put emphasis on different points, some of them to have details the others did not have because of their perspective. And even sometimes you may expect to have some reports that seem to be contradictory because the people are making assumptions and are not, maybe don't possess all of the information. However, if all four of those witnesses told you exactly the same thing in exactly the same order and with all the same details, then you would be very suspect that the report is genuine. So that's what we're talking about with discernible unity and differences. Those slight differences of emphasis and ordering and even what is reported are evidence that they are actual reports from an event rather than a contrived story that happened later. Continuing from the Gospels, you look in the book of Acts and you see that common and consistently in the book of Acts is the resurrection of Jesus. And we see here reports of Peter talking about the resurrection of Jesus in Acts 2, 24 through 36, Acts 3, 20 through 36, and Acts 10, 40 through 42. Stephen in Acts 7, 55 through 56. Paul in Acts 13, 30 through 41, and in chapter 17, 31 through 32, and chapter 22, verses 6 through 8, 24, chapter 24, 15 through 21, chapter 26, 13 through 23. So we see we have repeated references and proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not something that is obscure and mentioned infrequently. So in the gospel witness, in the book of Acts, so now we've got two different types of writings, Gospels and Acts. In addition, we go into the Pauline epistles. And Paul, who met Jesus on the Damascus Road, did affirm a bodily resurrection of Christ. Aside from the witnesses of Paul in Acts, as recorded in Acts, we see in 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 and 2 Timothy, we see an affirmation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the witness to the resurrection is plenty in the New Testament. Looking at 1 Corinthians 15 through chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." Note, Paul makes it clear in this passage that he's quoting from an earlier creed. So the confession of what Paul is quoting here in 1 Corinthians is referencing an existing statement about the resurrection of Christ and about Jesus that predates Paul's writing of this. So 3 to 5 years after the crucifixion is when that is probably written. So we're going back closer and closer to the event itself. In the general epistles, Peter and the author of Hebrews make the most references to the resurrection and of Christ. We see Hebrews 13:20 and then 1 Peter chapters 1 and 3. And in the Revelation of John, we see that Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, the living one who was dead, but is alive forever and ever, and he who died and came to life again. So all throughout the New Testament, in each type of literature, Gospels and Acts, in the epistles, and even in the Apocalypse, we see that the resurrection is affirmed and is important to the early church. So the biblical witness is plenty for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But turning from biblical witness, what about historical evidence for the resurrection? Now there's a few options that are available if you are going to look at the resurrection and if you're going to try to determine what to make of it from evidence that is more acceptable in the field of history. It's one thing to say that we accept the Bible on the authority of God and say that we have a faith commitment to our tradition and to what the Bible teaches and what the church has taught. But for someone who is going to examine this from a non-religious perspective, what would they be able to say about the resurrection if their goal is simply to determine whether that event is a historical event or not, or how to understand the event of the resurrection without applying a faith account to it? So there's a couple of options available. First is that it is a hoax, that the resurrection is actually false, but it has been propagated by different parties for their own means or their own interests. So the church, wanting to have a basis for its existence and to exert authority and to get money and all of those kind of things, that they portrayed the resurrection as if it was true, though it was actually not true, and they knew it. And so the resurrection initially was a hoax, and then it has been accepted and passed along. Another thing is that it's a myth, that it may be true in the sense of fables are true, that it may teach certain things, but that historically the resurrection was not something that took place in reality. So there's a difference between a hoax and a myth. One has an intention of deception. The other is trying to explain things by appealing to events and causes that are not fitting within the real world, but the intent is not deception. And the other thing, the other option is that it is an actual historical event. And then if that's the case, then it certainly is a very important event or supreme event in history. And so the resurrection would be actual, would be fact in that case. What about theories that deny the historicity of the resurrection? For the most part, these theories that we're going to look at that criticized the resurrection early on are not held in the same way that they're depicted today. Even liberal scholars are opting for different views of the resurrection than what we're going to look at as far as some of the different theories throughout the history of the church that have been advanced in order to dismiss or explain away the resurrection. The first grouping we will look at are stolen or missing body theories. And this is as old as the gospel witness and as fact as old as the resurrection itself. In Matthew 28:11 through 15, we see the idea that the disciples stole Jesus' body. And so if that's an accurate report, as we accept that it is, then we know that at the time of the resurrection and at the time the tomb was found to be empty, that the authorities said, let's explain this by saying the disciples stole the body. So that's a very old theory about what happened to Jesus' body, as an explanation of the empty tomb, and as a counter evidence toward the resurrection, is trying to undermine the resurrection. Ramirez also argued, and you see his dates, in 1694 to 1768, that the disciples stole the body and then fabricated the story of the resurrection for the purpose of gaining self-recognition and starting a new religion. And that is a position that is coming from some of the early work on the historical Jesus. That has been questioned very much in recent years. As you see here, a quote from Garrett, even modern rationalists have found this theory to be a psychological impossibility. There was just no reason for a first century Jewish perspective from that perspective that you would want to discard Judaism and have a new religion come about. The disciples of Jesus, and indeed the first century Jewish expectation, was that God was going to renew and restore the Jewish people, not to start a new religion. So that has been very severely criticized. Another view is that not the disciples, but that Joseph of Arimathea is the one who stole the body of Jesus. Schoenfield proposed in the Passover plot, published in 1965, that Jesus plotted with Lazarus and Joseph of Arimathea to pretend to fulfill Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah by faking his death on the cross. But the plan went awry when the Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear. Now, Schoenfield is not able to explain how the disciples are so motivated by a dying fake Messiah, but nonetheless, the idea that the resurrection had to be faked because the original plan to fake it went awry. So they just had to do the best they could. Presumably, if the plan had not failed and Jesus wouldn't have actually died, then he would have just shown up again. And so we see that as an explanation of the resurrection. So the body needed to be stolen to fulfill an earlier plot that had a twist in it. Another explanation is that the Jews or the Romans stole the body of Jesus. And that is, again, an attempt to explain the empty tomb. But what doesn't hold if that is the case, is when the disciples start talking about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. If the Romans or the Jews stole the body, they would have just been able to produce it. Say, no, he didn't rise from the dead. We have his body. Why didn't that happen? Because Christianity is not something that they're wanting to see continue. These followers of Jesus, what happened when a Messiah was crucified, or someone claiming to be a Messiah, someone who was rising up against Rome, what happened when they were executed is that the group generally disbanded because their leader was gone. That was part of the purpose. So when the group didn't disband and they continued to then claim that Jesus was resurrected, why didn't they just present the body and say, no, you see, he's actually not risen from the dead. We still have his body, and that would have dealt a crushing blow to the fledgling church. But that didn't happen. And why wouldn't Saul, who was well positioned within the Jewish community, have known if the Jews stole Jesus' body? Why would he have been converted if he knew that they had done that? And given his position, we expect that it's at least reasonable to think he might have known if that had happened. So whether the idea that the disciples stole Jesus' body, or some other characters from the New Testament stole Jesus' body that were not genuine disciples, not part of his immediate group that ends up founding the church, and the idea that the Roman or Jewish authorities stole the body just doesn't hold up. But that does not leave us without other possibilities. The swoon theory is advocated by Paulus, and you see his date, 1761 to 1851. He argues that Jesus did not die, and he was unconscious when buried. The cool air of the tomb then revived him, and he got out of the tomb. So, let's see if we can... The swoon theory, advocated by Paulus, you see his date, 1761 to 1851, argued that Jesus did not die. He was simply unconscious when buried, and the cool air of the tomb revived him, and he was able to get out. So the theory here, the swoon theory, denies the resurrection and accounts for the empty tomb by way of denying the death of Jesus initially. So whereas the previous examples we've looked at denied the resurrection by saying that Jesus his body was stolen, this theory would deny the resurrection by denying Jesus' death. So he was not really dead, he just appeared to be. And you know that cool air in Mediterranean-era tombs just has a healing effect. Of course, that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek. This is not a very plausible theory, because if you take seriously the account of the condition that Jesus was in at the time of his crucifixion, having been severely scourged and beaten and mistreated as he was in the accounts of the crucifixion, Jesus very well may have died from the beatings that happened. It was not uncommon for those types of beatings to end up leading to death. So that certainly could have been the case. And you compound that with the fact that he was crucified, and then the account of having a spear shoved into his side. It seems to be very unlikely that Jesus would have survived that event without a lot of very sophisticated modern medical treatment, and even then there's no guarantee. So the idea that simply putting someone in a cool cave after undergoing that, and that was enough that revived him, and he was then able to get out of the tomb, having pierced feet and hands and a side and that beating that he had, it just is implausible. So it's no longer in fashion as an explanation. Another group of theories are what you might call error theories. So you have a group here where it says the body was stolen or missing, and it tries to explain the resurrection by either saying that the body was taken by different groups that are possible candidates for that, or that Jesus didn't die, and so there's no body in the tomb because he didn't die in the first place. He just appeared to be dead. And then you have another category of theories that are error theories. That what happened was that the wrong person is the one who was crucified. Muslims, for example, deny the resurrection of Jesus by way of denying his crucifixion. So the Quran, as we see quoting from it here, they said, in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the Son of Mary, the Apostle of God, but they killed him not, nor crucified him. But it was made to appear to them, and those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow, for of a surety they killed him not. So, in the Quran, we have a denial of the resurrection by way of denying the crucifixion. So, Jesus was not crucified. In fact, Judas Iscariot is the one who was crucified, who is actually crucified. And so God deceives Jesus' enemies and rescues him and has Judas, who was the betrayer, crucified instead. Now, of course, that does get rid of the resurrection by getting rid of the crucifixion, which would then eviscerate Christianity, and there would be no point to it. And everything that Christians teach about reconciling of man to God through the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ would be gone. It would be no longer the case. We would certainly be wrong about that. And so that is the perspective that comes from the Quran. So we're not able to reconcile Islamic teaching with Christian teaching because it is vastly different there. Another error theory is the wrong tomb. And Chrysop Lake, you see his dates, 1872 to 1946, argue that the women went to the wrong tomb, and the gardener tried to direct them to the correct one. You know, where the whole idea here that women maybe not are the best with directions. They got confused. They went to the wrong tomb. That doesn't seem to be a very satisfying answer. That we know also the disciples, there's reports of the disciples running to the tomb, the other disciples, so they would have had to have gone to the wrong tomb also, and nobody picked up on the idea that this was the wrong tomb. Nobody was able to find the right tomb. It seems to be quite problematic. But that is a proposed solution. We deny the resurrection by saying they didn't check in the right place. I don't think that's very satisfying. So he says the idea of Matthew 28:6, he is not here, come see the place where the Lord lay, meant that the gardener was trying to say, you're in the wrong place, come over here and see where he is. But then he ignores the middle part of the verse that says, for he is risen as he said. So the idea that the women went to the wrong tomb and nobody ever figured it out does not seem to be a very satisfying theory as well. Another way of talking about this, or looking at the resurrection as being an error, is to suppose or theorize that people had a hallucination or visions of Jesus resurrected. And so these are known as hallucination or vision theories. And you have either subjective or objective. So Strauss, Renan, would both argue that the encounters with the resurrected Christ were internal visions brought on by the psychological stresses that the disciples were experiencing, so that they were really distraught and they hallucinated a resurrection. Okay, and that's the idea that their stress that they were under triggered them to think they saw Jesus actually alive, and that's what the reports are. So the resurrection is denied as an actual event, but seen to be a psychological event in the lives of Jesus' followers. John Dominic Crossan argues that the encounters may have been the result of visions and trances. But hallucinations may presuppose some expectation which the disciples don't have. And also, by their very nature, a vision is an individual thing, and certainly a hallucination is not something that people share. If you've ever been around someone who is hallucinating, it's not contagious. Someone who is hallucinating or experiencing internal stimuli does not share that with others. In fact, the others around them very clearly understand that what they are experiencing is not something that is in reality. Certainly, it's not something that 500 people or so could have and share together. The idea of a mass hallucination is not a plausible explanation. Now, there is at least a possibility that this was an objective vision. Hans Grass contends that the post-resurrection encounters were divinely caused visions designed to teach Jesus' disciples that his resurrection was a spiritual reality, and going to 1 Corinthians 15:44. Though this view is less objectionable, it does not deal with the fact of the empty tomb. So, is it possible that God gave 500 plus people an objective vision? Sure, that's a possibility. But it doesn't deal with the empty tomb. So this would deny the resurrection by claiming that the accounts of a resurrected Jesus were simply divine visions, divine actions that were not actual resurrection, but something that was done by God to teach people about a spiritual resurrection and not a physical resurrection. But again, it doesn't deal with the empty tomb, and it's not a very satisfactory position. Why did the church not figure out that these were just visions? Why do they seem to report them as if they are historical events? It doesn't seem to answer those questions. Another idea is that the accounts of the resurrection are a legend or a myth. Bultmann argued that the basic character of the New Testament is mythological. You can see his dates there, going from the 1880s to the 1970s. And he defines myth as the use of imagery to express the otherworldly in terms of this world, and the divine in terms of human life, the other side in terms of this side. And that's Garrett's quote. So the idea from Bultmann is that there was no resurrection, but they tried to talk about the reality of a new life in these terms. And it's difficult to talk about what is beyond without using descriptions of the actual world. So it's a legend. It's something that is not directly reality. It's not actual event that happened, but it's teaching truths about the transcendent world in terms of the physical world. So this would deny the resurrection by way of denying the reports of the resurrection as being intended to communicate fact about this world. They would be intended to communicate fact about the transcendent world or the spiritual world, but the best they could do was use the language that we have. Of course, this is not the way that the New Testament seems to present the resurrection. It seems to present it as an actual event, not as a myth. And one of the other issues is the closeness of the resurrection to the event. Is it true that throughout, if you look back in history, that there are certain individuals that have myths that have grown up around them, and that or have exploits that we're very doubtful that the exploits are actual exploits that happen, things that happen? Yes, that's the case. The problem is that it takes a long time for those to develop. There's myths about even the Roman emperors and Augustus about things that they did, but those myths don't arise until those people have been dead a long time. And what's the problem here is you have very, very early on, very shortly after Jesus' death, we see people saying that he's resurrected. the issue with myths is you can't really falsify them because everybody who was there is gone and they've passed on. But we see that if the resurrection was a myth, it could have been falsified simply by people going to find wherever Jesus was buried. There's not enough time elapsing from the death of Jesus to the point where they're talking about a resurrection so that nobody could go and check. So that makes it doubtful that it's a myth. What about the body of Jesus then? Some deny the resurrection by denying, as we've seen, that by denying that they were at the right tomb, that it was a vision, or different things like that, denying that Jesus was actually crucified. But how could you explain in a naturalistic sense the missing body of Jesus and assuming that the body was actually gone and it wasn't able to be produced? Well, John Dominic Crossan theorizes that Jesus' corpse was probably put in a shallow grave, barely covered with dirt at all, and eaten by wild dogs. In his opinion, Jesus' resurrection story, or his entombment and resurrection story, was a result of wishful thinking. Now, Crossan does have some historical points. One of the horrors of crucifixion was the fact that your body normally did not receive proper burial and proper handling. Oftentimes the bodies were forced to stay or were not permitted to be taken down, that they were made to remain on the cross until birds, other animals, rot would cause them to fall off. So for Crossan to say that the likelihood of someone who was crucified is that if they were buried at all, it would probably be a shallow grave, and probably what would have happened is that animals would have eaten the carcass, eaten the person's body. That's not a bizarre thing to think could have happened to many people who were crucified. We know that did happen. However, we have sufficient evidence, I believe, to suggest that Jesus was not treated that way. There were a number of events, including the closeness to the Passover and the different elements we see. We get positive reports of his body being taken down. We know that not everybody who was crucified remained on the cross to rot. We know some people who were crucified were actually taken down from the cross before they were dead and then survived crucifixion. So we know that it is not uncommon or fantastic to think that Jesus' body was actually buried. That did happen. And of course, the gospel accounts tell us that not only was Jesus' body taken down, but also the other bodies were taken down because of the importance of the religious timing for the Jewish people, and they didn't want to see bodies up on crosses. So Crossan, at least, he puts forth a plausible option of what could have happened, but we have significant evidence that says that that didn't actually happen in this case, so I don't think we need to accept Crossan's theory there. Well, now we've got a picture of the resurrection, and I want you to take a moment and look at this, and I'm sure some of you have probably seen this picture before, and I want you to think, where have I seen this picture of the resurrection? It's very neat. Jesus has very nice white robes. He has a particular facial structure there, longer hair and the beard coming out of this tomb. So how many of you have seen this before is a question I would ask if we were all in class. This picture of the resurrection. Does anybody know where it came from? I assume many of us have seen it, and maybe some of us know where it's come from, and perhaps some of us don't. But it's actually Mormon art depicting the resurrection. And I have this here simply because with the advent of the internet and the ability to grab photos of things, we need to be careful, because this is very closely identified in LDS literature and art. And so if we were to use it in some kind of function at our church, one, we have to be careful that we're not violating copyrights, but two, it could give an implicit endorsement or acceptance of other groups, particularly the ones that produce this, which would be the LDS Church, and we may not want to do that. And so my point about this picture is just to be careful, to make sure that you don't, one, violate copyright laws by using things, but two, that you know where things came from, and that if you're not wanting to endorse something, that you don't do something that could be taken as an endorsement. To conclude about the theories of the resurrection, Habermas points out the greatest opponents of the naturalistic theories have been higher critics or others who were criticizing it and of the same persuasion. He states, naturalistic theories have failed to explain away this event, that is the resurrection, chiefly because each is disproven by the known historical facts. Additionally, critics themselves have attacked each theory. For instance, in the 19th century, Strauss disarmed the swoon theory, while Keim and others pointed to the weaknesses in the hallucination theory. Form-critical studies later revealed the futility of the legend theory, popularized by the history of religion school of thought. In the 20th century, such diverse thinkers as Barth, Tillich, and Borkman and Pannenberg are examples of higher critical theologians who have rejected these alternative hypotheses. So, it's not just that evangelicals have been the ones to pick apart some of these theories that deny the resurrection. It has been other critical theologians that are not necessarily believers in the same sense that we would accept the idea of being a believer. So, I think that's interesting for us to note. Well, going from some of the historical theories that would deny the historical reliability of the resurrection, what about what's on the current scene? We've got several options here that we're going to look at. I think there are 5 options. Yes, 5 options that we're going to look at here as contemporary models of the resurrection. The first is that the reality of the resurrection is seriously questioned or dismissed. The original nature of the eyewitness experience could not be ascertained is the idea, and we have some of those that would fall into that camp, with Bultmann, Marx, and such. So the idea is the resurrection either is not something that we can determine, or we're just going to dismiss it because we've got some predispositions that make us want to do so, that we don't have to. Perhaps we think the resurrection is not important for the ethical teachings of Jesus, and so we don't need to get bogged down in that. Or you might say, which is more of what we're going here, is that we just can't make a clear determination historically about the resurrection. We can know what the church told us about it, but we can't verify that, and we can't really understand whether their knowledge or what they were telling us was meant to be taken as actual fact or some kind of a teaching about a spiritual reality. So that one option would be to just question or dismiss the resurrection. A second option, kind of coming a little closer the other way, is going to be that the actual literal or historical resurrection may be true, but it's not something that could be verified. That the ability to determine the reliability of the event is just too far gone, and the evidence has been tainted or potentially tainted to the point that we might not be able to verify it at all. The important element is the nature of the disciples' experience and the truth that the resurrection can only be accepted by faith. And here we see Barth, Brunner, Bonhoeffer, and others that would take that view, that the resurrection could be a literal reality, but the important thing is not the literal reality of the resurrection, but the experience of a disciple of Jesus. And the idea that we can only accept the resurrection as an act of faith, and so in some regards, even trying to have non-faith reasons for believing the resurrection would be undermining faith itself. So that's a second view that is not rejecting the resurrection, but saying that it's really not something that we could determine And also seeking that determination will be an undermining of faith itself. Third view is the resurrection is probable, and an abstract reconstruction of the historical nature of the appearances is possible. So, saying that the resurrection itself is likely, and that we could construct what actually happened as far as the nature of the appearances is something that could be done. And this view would say that the empty tomb is the best explanation of the available data, but it still argues that the resurrection is really an eschatological event, and you can't determine it with historical methodology. Although it may be verified in the future, we just simply can't verify it now. Jesus' appearances then were more along the lines of private revelation, and the appearances cannot be known except through faith. So that's shifting a little further down the road from the previous position, saying that it's likely that the resurrection occurred, and that the appearances of Jesus are possibilities, but we just don't have enough evidence or enough or the right kind of way to determine, given historical methods, whether or not these events are something that we can say with certainty actually happened, or with a high degree of reliability, probably not certainty there. So we would then relegate them to the private experiences of the disciples. Now, at some point in the future, the resurrection very well may be verified, but we can't do it at this point. Fourth position is that a literal resurrection of Jesus and an empty tomb is the most probable solution based upon the available data. And so we see Pannenberg and Dunn that are in this group, but Pannenberg rejects an actual bodily resurrection in favor of a spiritual body, which appeared from heaven, was recognized as Jesus spoke, and in Paul's case was accompanied by a phenomenon of light. So you've gone further down the line even to say that the best solution for the empty tomb and what happened is the resurrection of Jesus. So that's, again, coming down to say the best solution, but you don't necessarily have to see that as a physical resurrection, as Pannenberg doesn't. He sees it as a spiritual resurrection. And finally, the fifth option is that a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus and an empty tomb is the best solution of the Easter event based upon the evidence. This position differs from number 4 in its affirmation of a resurrection body, and this is not only the classic Orthodox position, but it's also affirmed by evangelicals. So evangelical theologians and obviously the church, the evangelical churches, would assume that this view is the proper one. And again, we have more art depicting the resurrection of Jesus. There is good reasons to accept the resurrection as being an actual historical event. And so here what we've got is an apologetic for an actual historical bodily resurrection of Jesus. So most critical theologians, as you look at the notes here on the slide, most of them will agree with these facts. Not all of them. Not all of the facts, and certainly not all of the scholars. But there is substantial agreement on what we're going to talk about here. So now today, virtually all scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion and that his body was buried. So those that have denied either the crucifixion, the burial, or his death, all of those are really out of fashion and they're no longer accepted. Now, due to the death of Jesus, his disciples were despondent, believing that all hope was gone. Exactly what you would expect for a revolutionary false Messiah who was killed at the hands of the authorities. You'd expect that to happen. They would be despondent, and then eventually they would disband. Now, at this point, many contemporary scholars add that the burial tomb was found empty a few days later, but that did not initially cause belief in the disciples. So this is somewhat of an anomaly. Now, not everybody accepts that, but there is sufficient evidence, or a lot of evidence rather, for the idea that the tomb was found empty. But note that this did not initially cause belief in the disciples. They are probably a little bit more perplexed. And then it's virtually unanimous that soon afterwards the disciples had experiences which they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus. Okay, now it's very different to say the disciples had experiences that they believed to be of a resurrected Jesus, and to say Jesus was actually resurrected. Those are two different things. One is talking about the experiences that people took to be the resurrected Jesus, and the other is saying that Jesus was actually raised from the dead. And again, hallucinations or different, they could have been deceived would be a way that they could have had experiences that they believed were Jesus' resurrection. Of course, one way, which was probably the correct, that they view that they actually did encounter Jesus, and that's why they had those experiences, also explains it. But note, to simply say that the disciples had experiences that they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus is not the same thing as saying that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So there is a distinction there. But let's look at these list of at this apologetic, and let's look at these bullet points. Okay, so Jesus died due to crucifixion. Jesus was buried soon after. Jesus' death caused despair and loss of hope in the disciples. We've already mentioned all this. A few days later, the tomb in which Jesus was buried was found empty. Now, this is accepted by a lot of scholars, but not as many as the other points. The disciples had real experiences they thought were literal or actual appearances of the risen Christ. So, again, the disciples had experiences, and they thought that they experienced a risen Jesus. The disciples were transformed by these experiences from timid and despondent to bold and joyous. So there was a real transformation that was linked to these appearances that they took to be Jesus. The message of his resurrection was the center of preaching in the early church. So this is not an addition that comes in later on. It is the focal point of the Christian message. The message was especially proclaimed in Jerusalem, the same city where Jesus had recently died and been buried. Okay, that's difficult to deal with if he had not actually been resurrected, because that would have been a place where easily, if it was not an accurate story, it could have been disproven. As a result of the preaching, the church was born, so the disciples and their work lead to the establishment of the church. Even though the early church was entirely Jewish, the day of worship was changed to Sunday. So we do see a shifting from the Sabbath, and that is due to the resurrection of Jesus. And again, why would that happen if Jesus was not actually risen from the dead? James, a brother of Jesus who had been a skeptic, was converted when he believed that he saw the resurrected Jesus. So you have someone in a position to not accept false teaching, not necessarily accept that something is the case there. So James, initially not believing that Jesus was raised, but then coming to believe, is significant. And then a few years later, Paul also was converted to the Christian faith by an experience that he likewise thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So Paul again is converted. And why is he converted? Because he had an experience that he took to be an appearance of Jesus. Now, we need to note that the actual exit from the tomb is not narrated in the New Testament, but that's not really important for us. But that is just important to note that. So these points here, when you put them all together, what's the best way to explain that evidence? And I think that an actual resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of this evidence. We have another picture of the resurrection here, and this is, I believe, an Orthodox picture. You see some Orthodox ways of depicting the disciples and Jesus and others in this picture. Oh, going back the wrong way. What kind of evidence do we have for the resurrection? Well, we're going to look at that. Subjective evidence is personal experience. You can also call this a pragmatic text. Does believing in Jesus make a difference? Does the idea of the resurrection and what that would mean work? So that would be personal experience or personal views of the efficacious nature of believing in the resurrection. And then also objective evidence, and that's something that's historically verifiable. And we're talking about something that you can verify via historical methodology, not scientific methodology. Okay, verifiable in a sense of probability, not absolute or improbable or impossible. Okay, it asks the question, does the evidence persuade us that the event actually happened? Another event that is like this, did Washington actually cross the Delaware? Now you can't use a test tube to determine that. You can't use, it's not something that you could reproduce. You have to use historical methods. And the same kind of thing for the resurrection of Jesus. It is not a reproducible event. We're not saying that you can mix a couple of chemicals and end up with a third, with a compound, or that you can mix acid and a base and end up with water and a salt. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a historical event. You have to use historical criteria. You can't use scientific criteria. So saying, well, we can't verify and cause someone who is dead to come back to life has nothing to do with the report about Jesus' resurrection. So we need to note that. What follows are a summation of some of the evidence for the resurrection. And naturalistic theories fail to explain away the event, and many have been disproved and rejected even by liberal scholarship. So some of the things that these evidences, you can't just write them off. Okay, and even those who are not believers as we are can't just write this evidence off. It does work and meet genuine needs. There's subjective evidence. Many people's lives have been changed by the resurrection. Okay, so there is that subjective evidence, and it's a large quantity of people who have been changed in that regard. But looking at more objective evidence, the birth and continuance or continuation of Christianity with the central message of the resurrection. If that had not happened, why did the church start in the first place? Why did it continue? And why has the focus continually been or consistently been on the resurrection? The changing of the day of worship from the Sabbath to Sunday by people who were Jews. You are hard-pressed to explain that apart from a very significant event, like someone who claimed to have a special relationship with God and then was crucified and died and buried, was actually dead and then came back to life. That can help. Apart from that, how do you have people changing the Sabbath? That's just not something that seems to be a very probable option. The testimonies that women were the first to see the resurrected Jesus, in spite of the invalid nature of their witness in the first century. Women were not considered to be as reliable of a witness as a man. So if you were reporting this, or if you were making it up, making the story up in this world, you would not have sent women to be the first people to report this event. It would have been men. The fact that women are the first to report the event suggests that probably women were the first to go there actually, and that the report is actually reflective of what happened. Again, because if you were trying to falsify this and make it believable, you would not have sent women to be the first people to report it. You would have sent men. There's a radical change in the disciples, new power, courage, and they're faithful to even death. That change of the disciples' behavior, how do you explain that? Well, the resurrection is probably the best evidence for that. It's difficult to explain how someone would be willing to be faithful to this idea of someone to the point of death, that they would die if they knew that Jesus had not actually been resurrected. That's hard to explain. The moral character of the eyewitnesses. We have some significant moral character there that we have to deal with. The fact of the empty tomb, that there's no body in the empty tomb. How do you explain that? And again, we've seen naturalistic views, but the empty tomb does have to be dealt with. The numerous and various resurrection appearances. Jesus had a number of appearances that are given to us and that are repeated for us. And the New Testament. So it's not that it's simply a single appearance or claim of an appearance. There's multiple. Another picture here, the resurrection Jesus saying, resurrected Jesus, don't touch me because I've not yet ascended. Just sticking that in there for us to break up the monotony. Some more, continuing with the evidence, the impossible nature of mass hallucination. Again, hallucinations are not things that are shared. The reported appearances which lasted 40 days and then completely stopped. Okay, so Jesus' appearances have not continued to happen throughout history the same way that they did in the first 40 days. Now, that's not to say people haven't claimed to have experiences of Jesus, but those are definitely not, at that point, bodily resurrection encounters with Jesus that are of a resurrection body. Those, maybe they claim to have encountered Jesus in a vision or a dream or seen him like that. But we're talking about physically walking around. Those appearances lasted for a short period of time and then stopped. Okay. 50-day interval between the resurrection and the proclamation at Pentecost in Jerusalem itself. Again, less than 2 months. People would have known Jesus was dead and his body would still have been available for refutation if he was not resurrected in a 50-day period. A 500-day or 50-year interval would be different, but not a 50-day interval. A lot of Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. Again, the fulfilling of expectations in the life, ministry, and death and resurrection of Jesus. The Jewish leaders could not disprove the message. That should have been fairly easy to do if the body were available or if there were good reason to doubt. But the Jewish leaders apparently did not disprove the message because Christianity grew. The conversion of skeptics, Paul and James, speaks to the event. Both, again, could have been there, would have had access to people, could have talked to people who lived through it, and they could have disproven it if they had or found evidence of it being false if there was evidence of that sort available. The accepted character and claims of Jesus. Given the portrayals of Jesus as a teacher and respected, and the fact that he made claims about God, and that with the claims that he made, the resurrection shows vindication of Jesus, that his claims were actually the case, that gives us some reasons to accept the idea of the resurrection. The articles left in the empty tomb, where we have the cloth and the clothes leaving behind there. The unexpected nature of the resurrection. The articles left in the tomb are a detail that you wouldn't just make up and add. But you might report it if it actually happened, but it's not something that you would add. The unexpected nature of the resurrection. The disciples were not expecting it. They weren't all sitting around saying, "Oh, great, he's back." They were, in fact, not expecting it. They had forgotten or not properly understood Jesus' teaching, and probably the unexpected nature of even the crucifixion. They were not expecting that. We see this seemed to have caught Jesus' disciples, as you read the Gospels, off guard. So the fact that he was resurrected and they were not expecting it, again, it's not something they were prepping for and expecting. And then reliable eyewitness documents recording the facts, and that's the New Testament. So you've got reports here of people who were there in the New Testament. Okay? Well, why is the resurrection significant? Well, it vindicates Jesus. One, that he is the Son of God. In Romans 1:4, and declared to be the Son of God with the power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. Jesus, if resurrected, was resurrected by God. And if God resurrected Jesus, and Jesus had taught certain things about God, then that vindicates his position. If Jesus would have been lying about God, or had been wrong about God, then why would God have resurrected him to show that he was right? The resurrection, if true, proves very much about the Christian faith and very much about Jesus, because it affirms the teachings that he himself taught. It also affirms or shows that Jesus is both Lord and Christ. Acts 2:32 and 36, this Jesus God is raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus whom you crucified both Lord and Christ. So his authority and the fact that he's fulfilling this anointed role of the Old Testament expectation of the Messiah. The resurrection ensures our own salvation. 1 Corinthians 15:17 through 19. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. Paul gets it. The resurrection ensures our own salvation. And if it's not the case, then we are really in the wrong field. We need to go do something different because we're lying about God, and we don't have the hope that we think we have. And so we ought to be very pitied because we sometimes, at least at this point, would undergo persecution for our faith. And not only that, our faith is false. So that puts us in a bad spot. The resurrection ensures the objective reality of our salvation. In Romans 4:25, he was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised for our justification. So it puts us in a right relationship with God. Our salvation is supported or assured by that. It ensures the subjective reality of our salvation, which would be regeneration rather than justification. 1 Peter 1:3, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And the resurrection guarantees our own resurrection. And we have a passage here from 1 Corinthians to look at with that. And from 1 Corinthians 15:35 and 36. But someone will say, how are the dead raised up, and with what body they come? You fool, or thou fool. There. And we have, of course, have another picture of some angels at the tomb with the resurrected Jesus in this. So, what about the character of the resurrection body? We have some analogies here from 1 Corinthians that we can look at. 3 different analogies, one of seeds, one of flesh, and one of stars. And so we can see that, and I don't want to go through and read all of these scriptures this time. As we're going through it, you can certainly read over that. You can see that just as you have a picture of a seed dying to grow, you have an analogy of the type of flesh, and that the resurrection body will be a different kind of flesh. And the analogy of the stars that have greater glory, greater and lesser glory, or brightness. To apply the resurrection for 1 Corinthians 15:42, in this passage, the seeds will give way to a glorious body. It's sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. You're familiar with this passage, very likely. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. Is sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. And you can see some additional points here, from rotting to imperishable, shameful to honorable, weakness to strength, natural to spiritual, in those different verses. And types of flesh, there are different types of bodies, just like there are different types of flesh. A natural body, a spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15:44 to 46 here. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, afterward the spiritual. So Paul is saying that Jesus is not immaterial, but immortal, that his flesh is glorified and going to last. And then looking at the analogies of the stars, the first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are made of dust, and is the heavenly man. So also are those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. So Paul here is saying that the resurrected body comes from the old body, but is different in the sense that it is more glorious than the old body. As we start to sum up in that passage, the mystery of the resurrection body, going through verses 51 to 53, the transformation will occur to the living as well as the dead. Of course, we have the passage here, behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we'll all be changed. So we see that, the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. The mystery, what is once hidden is going to be revealed, and the moment some are going to sprout without being planted, it will happen that some may not have to undergo death, but will still be changed. And then the glory of the body, the resurrection body, continuing. So when the corruptible is put on incorruption, and this mortal is put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. So we see how the resurrection body will be glorious, and we look at seeing the joy of the resurrection in verses 54 and 55, the gratitude of the resurrection 56 and 57, and the confidence of the resurrection in 58. Finally, we'll close with a quote that was by Ben Franklin when he was 22. Now, later Franklin seems to abandon some of these ideas, but it is interesting. It's interesting that at least he wrote this at one point. The body of Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped off, its lettering and gilding lies here food for worms. But the work will not be lost, for it will appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. Now that's a very beautiful picture of the idea of the resurrection, that this body that we have, worn out, used up, no longer beautiful and glorious and what it could have been, and being put down and placed somewhere as food for worms, but the work is not lost. Get that? The work will not be lost. It will appear again in a newer, more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author, brought to be what was intended from the beginning, better than what we are currently. And that's the idea of the resurrection. Certainly, we can have a hope for that. Now, Franklin, of course, his perspective probably changed over the years. But anyway, what a beautiful thought to end with, as we've talked about the resurrection of Jesus. And then we take some of that to our understanding of our own resurrection in the future.